Hello, and welcome to The Alt Left.
Welcome back, everyone, for a fun episode of The Alt Left. This one, we are taking another week off because, I don't know, Matt sucks. He's decided having children is somehow important to his life.
I don't know why kids aren't that important.
Yeah, I want to be a good dad. Dude, my dad was terrible. Look how amazing I turned out. And Kay's dad is great. And look how much he sucks. So
that is also true.
Let's just be real. Dads don't matter. And neither does Matt. So we screw that guy. He's dead to me until next week. But yeah, so we're giving him another break off. I was actually a guest this last week on Between the Liars podcast. It's the podcast from Ryan, the libertarian we had on a little while back. So I joined him and a friend of his who's a writer on Toilet Paper USA, and we had a good debate about voting and immigration and dreamers and reality. So I hope you enjoy it. It was interesting. It was definitely the opposite of what it was when Ryan was here. I was definitely the girl on the couch in that Brazzers photo. It was definitely 2-on-1, but it was good. We kept it civil. It was nice. And I hope you guys like it.
All right. Hello and welcome to Between the Liars with Ryan. And I am joined by two very special guests today. We have Joe Bob and we have Chris. How's it going, guys? They nodded for those who are on our non-video audience. All right, let's start with Chris. Chris is from the Alt Left podcast. Chris, why don't you give us a little pitch about your background there and where they can find your show?
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having us, man. Yeah, the Alt Left podcast, we are a delightful little echo chamber. We are a communist, a progressive, and a liberal who basically kind of argue at the nuance on the left, and we take politics and news from a leftist perspective. So there is no fighting about left or right on our show, which makes it a little less interesting, I think. But it's really good if you're into the divisions of one side. We really take deep dives into historical and political stuffs from a leftist perspective. Best place to find us, honestly, is on Twitter at the Alt Left Pod. So it's just at the Alt Left Pod. You can also find us at Facebook and Instagram, that kind of thing. But our link tree's on our Twitter. Easiest way to find us anywhere. And we broadcast everywhere you can get a podcast.
And I actually met Chris through a random solicitation. I sent him a message and was like, hey, if you ever want to have someone with a diverse viewpoint on there, I'd love to come on. We had a great discussion, and you can check that out. And Joe Bob is the host of the Daily Caller Live.
Yeah, Chris, that's like great. I hadn't read your Twitter thing. That seems like a fascinating conversation. I probably would disagree on some policy things, but like I feel like the right needs to do that sort of thing if they don't already, kind of have like the varying perspectives of different nuances within their side. But anyways, yeah, sorry. It seems super cool. So I host the Daily Caller Live show, which is just a morning talk show-ish thing. I don't really even know what to compare it to. I just kind of sit here in my little studio area and rant for 30 minutes about the news and what's going on. And I tend to have a pretty libertarian perspective about things. You know, social issues are less important to me in particular in terms of how I take things, and generally talk about money being spent at the federal level. So that's kind of what I do. I also am a contributor over at TP USA, Turning Point USA, and make jokes about the news. That's my take here. I mostly just make jokes about the news. There's a bunch of serious people talking about news all the time, and that's great if you want that sort of thing. I'm kind of a lighter hearted, we're going to have fun. There are serious issues to be talked about, but you doom and gloom every day and nobody ends up happy. So yeah, that's what I do. I appreciate you having me. Oh, also really, really quick, Joe Bob, J-O-B-O-B. One grandparent was Joe, the other one was Bob. My parents YOLO'd and made junior high miserable. So
I was wondering where that came from, because that is probably one of the more unique names I've seen. I also randomly came across Joe Bob on TikTok, of all places. I was like, he's got a link to his Instagram. I'll shoot him a DM, see if he's ever interested in coming on. And lo and behold, here we are. So this will probably be one of the more diverse conversations we've had, and I'm excited for it. Today we're going to discuss more aspects of voting legislation. Just like 2 episodes ago, they had a nice little sandwich of Josh and I took an easy week and just talked about what's wrong and what's good with college education. And now we're back to what we didn't get to cover for things with voting legislation, because they've had H.R. 1, the For the People Act, you've had the Freedom to Vote and John Lewis Writing Acts, Advancement Acts, which all of them are basically attempting to loosen or federalize voting regulations and rules. We're going to unpack some of the specifics, I think, and then we'll just kick it off with, I guess, a discussion question. So I'll kick it to you two. Recently, New York allowed their non-citizens to be able to vote in the local elections. Obviously, because of state and federal laws, they cannot vote for like your state legislator or the president, but they are allowing them to vote at the local level. And I'm curious if you guys think that that's a good or a bad idea.
You want to take that first, Chris?
Sure, why not? So my thing is, again, and Ryan said that perfectly. They do not get to elect federal politicians at all. This measure only applies, first of all, to legal residents that are permanent residents. These are people holding green cards. These are dreamers. My grandmother was one of these. She came over to the United States, married my grandfather, and her mother made her promise her on her deathbed she wouldn't become an American. She was British. And so she was a permanent resident alien, couldn't vote. She was a Republican, but could not vote. And that always drove her nuts, but she kept to it. And I think that's the kind of people this is aimed at. This is not for people fleeing into the city randomly to swing elections. These are people who live in New York, spend their lives there. They are citizens. And most importantly, they're taxpayers. If we're going to say there is no taxation without representation, I think it is fair, especially being that half the taxes they pay are federal anyway, at least for their, this is local races. This is city council, borough presidents, right? This is local stuff in the community they live. And I think if we're going to have a nation that does not have open borders, does not make immigration easy like it used to. New York used to be an open door where show up, say what's up to the Statue of Liberty, go through Ellis Island for processing, change your name to something American sounding, and you're in. That was it. That was the end of the story. And now it takes decades and massive amounts of funds, huge legal hoops. So if we're going to let people live here and pay taxes, I believe they at least, I don't think it's bad that we're letting these people, again, these are not random people showing up at the shores. These are people who live here, are registered here, have careers here, pay taxes here. If they want to have a slight say in things like borough president and city council, I actually think that's fair. What about you, Joe Bob?
Dude, so I think this is good conversation because I feel like there is definitely common ground. From a 30,000-foot view, it's a slippery slope to me, letting people vote who aren't residents here. But to hit on a point that you brought up, which is a good point, I think the bigger problem is how freaking long it takes for people to become citizens. There's a guy I go to church with who's from Uganda, hardworking dude, fantastic family. He's the type of person we want as an American citizen. It took him 17 years to get his wife and kids from Uganda to the United States. Now, regardless of your political background, and regardless of what he thinks, I probably disagree with him politically on things, but he is a hardworking contributor to society, and it took, again, 17 years to get his family here and become a citizen that can actually vote in our elections. So I think this seems like a very small band-aid to try and cover up a bigger problem that is the bureaucracy that slows down the immigration system in our country. Personally, I don't think this is a great idea because of where it could lead and all that sort of stuff. I understand the reasoning behind it, but I think if we fix the bigger problem that is the jumbled up bureaucratic nonsense that is the immigration system, which I think we can all agree should be fixed, then this isn't even really an issue because it's just not relevant, because people that have come here and are contributing to society can vote because they're citizens now, and because we welcome people that are going to come and contribute to the society that we all are trying to better constantly.
So would you say that you would be in favor of something like people who come to this country, obviously, there's a background scan done, that kind of thing, make sure you're not some crazy serial killer, right? And you come in, you get a visa, and you spend a year or two naturalizing, working, getting ready to pass the citizen test, that you should just be kind of allowed through at that point, right? As long as you can pass the citizenship test and you can live here for a small amount of time, a year, 6 months, 2 years, whatever, and you work, you pay taxes, you're a responsible citizen, that should kind of open up an automatic pathway to citizenship. Because if that's the case, then I would be totally in favor of not having a measure like this.
Yeah, well, if you're looking at it from now, there's obviously a lot of nuances into that pathway, like who gets in, how do they get in, do we stop other people, we can't let everybody in, so where do we draw the line? Those nuances aside, if somebody comes here in a legal route, and again, I would personally like to streamline that. But yeah, no, I would definitely agree. Come here, my dad's an immigrant, and I watched throughout my childhood him wrestle with the immigration system and finally be able to vote when I was in high school. He'd been here, since he was 6 or 7 years old. That's crazy. And again, regardless of the politics of people who are coming in to vote, if people are coming in the right and legal way, we're welcoming to them, and we always should be welcoming to them. And I don't think we should penalize people people who are doing it the right way by making it 15, 20, 30 years before they can become citizens and vote. So in that respect, yeah, like if we streamline that process, let people who are going to come in and work hard and contribute to our society work towards citizenship, yeah, this law seems unnecessary. Again, zoom out, the bigger picture feels like we agree on this, that the federal government needs to freaking do something about the immigration system and solidify it in a way that makes sense and isn't so bogged down by nonsense.
This is great because all three of us overlap on the idea that it needs to be reformed.
Yeah.
I agree with Joe Bob that I think that the principle of allowing people to vote who are not citizens and they don't have that stake becomes problematic and can potentially lead to issues down the road, especially if it's allowing them to vote at, let's say, in the future, state, federal levels. I also think that it takes way too long to allow people to become citizens. If we reform that, then I think, again, this bill becomes redundant. The big issue with this specific one that I have is that they only have to be there for 30 days.
Yeah.
So to me, I think that undercuts your point earlier, Chris, about, they're not just coming to just sway elections, because with that short of a period, I think we could see that. Are we? No, not at the moment. But I think that could lead to it.
It's residents for 30 days to vote in like that city council region to be in that voting district. That's not the only requirement to apply for this, though. You have to have a permanent residency already. You can't just jump off a plane and 30 days be here. You have to already have a green card or be one of the dreamers. Like
they are required. Okay, then that's okay. That's a good.
But if you want to like vote in District 7 or whatever, you have to have lived in District 7 for 30 days, like have a gas bill and that kind of thing.
And I don't think people are just flooding to sway your city council election either. So, but what were you going to say earlier, Chris? I want to give that back
I was just going to ask Joe. Joe Bob had a. I wasn't expecting this much agreement from the three of us, so I guess that kind of led me on to something like the Dreamers. We're talking about people who have come here in good faith. I find a lot of pushback on. Again, the right is the one who holds back the Dreamers Act and stops Dreamers from being citizens. These are people who were born outside our borders, but have been here since they were in diapers and have spent their entire lives here. And again, these are people who have clean criminal records, people who are working, paying taxes, being responsible citizens. Why aren't we? I can't think of a better way. How do you have a more legitimate way of proving that you can exist in a society when you've spent your entire life there and kept your nose clean and done what you're supposed to do?
Totally. Chris, I'm not sure which role you play with the progressive, the communist, and the liberal. Which one is it? I'm just curious.
I'm the commie. I am as left as it gets, my friend. Mostly, actually, right now we're talking about the nuance, though. I have a couple right-wing beliefs.
I got you. Okay. I was just curious. In terms of, DACA is put into place, a decade ago from the Obama administration, and it allows people who, like you say, are now labeled as dreamers. That, again, seems like a Band-Aid to a bigger problem. If you have everything legalized and you have everything streamlined, you don't have that DACA situation. One of my best friends, guy in my wedding, is a DACA kid. And again, watching him go through the process is absolutely insane. He is a contributor to society. He pays taxes. We don't really talk politics, so I don't really know where he stands on things, but a phenomenal dude who participates in the American experiment. That being said, it's my understanding, and if I remember correctly, this is 5 years ago, there was some legislation in the federal government in which the Trump administration had just pathway to citizenship for all the DACA people in return for higher border security, or quote unquote the wall. And if my memory serves me correct, I believe Pelosi shot it down. And this is now a political thing of it's easier to use DACA as a political weapon than to actually give them what they want. If that's the compromise made at the federal level of legalize all the DACA people, but also shore up the border and have a system that works, I'm inclined to be okay with that, just because we've gone, obviously this is a problem we don't want to have, but since we've kind of laxed everything the last, 30, 40 years, and we have this problem, if that's the compromise on the table, I'm inclined to accept that, again, with the trade-off being, people that are here and contributing to society, paying taxes, all that, fine, let them stay, but shut the thing down until we get some sort of regimented process that works. Does that answer your question, kind of?
I guess my question is, why does it need a pound of flesh? Why do we need a compromise? Why do we need a caveat to allow people who have spent their lives here, who are tax-paying, contributing members of society? Why are we saying, well, okay, we will grant you citizenship if we get blank? Why does there need to be a sale? Why can't we do both, I guess is my question mark, because pushing DACA forward to pathway for instant citizenship is a simple act of legislation. The Senate could pass it like that. It would be instantaneous. You could grant them citizenship, and we can also work on solving our border crisis. And I don't know why it always has to be one or the other.
I think the left wants something and the right wants something. And in the same way that the left wouldn't just give the right money for a border wall, like they would probably not, the right wouldn't do the same for DACA because it's not their priority.
But why don't they? Why doesn't the right want DACA? Because again, DACA sounds like perfect compromise of left and right. Like this is a legal, great pathway to good citizens. This isn't a flood of people who aren't Americanized, who haven't assimilated into the culture. These are people who spent their lives here. Like this seems like what the right should be dreaming about in terms of immigration.
Chris, are you asking why is the federal government broken? That seems like a bigger question to me. Again, I don't think we're super far off. Sorry, quick little tangent. I think the polarized sides of the political aisle are so much more in agreement than obviously the media wants to give attention to, or some of your super extremes want to give attention to. But Chris, I would ask you, if that was on the table of like, all right, let's figure out this border situation, and people use the term the wall, but let's just say border security as a whole, so we're not having 175,000 people come across a month like we've had for the last year. In return, we make a pathway to citizenship for DACA kids. If that were on the table, would you accept that?
It would depend. And again, I think there's a lot of nuance. Again, and we could spend 6 hours going into that, obviously. I know that's not what you're going for here. The problem is in terms of border security, well, what are we talking about? Because do I think that borders need to be regulated? Sure. That's fine. But border regulation left or right looks very different. You know, border regulation left is checkpoints and open access with security checkpoints, whereas right, it's a wall and concentration camps. And by the way, I know you're going to catch me in this one. Yes, Obama built those concentration camps, but I don't consider Obama a leftist.
Oh, interesting.
Obama is just a right winger with a D slapped in front of his name. Obama deported more people than any president in U.S. history. A lot of things that are laid at the feet of Trump were things Obama did. But why does it need to be that? Because it's like, imagine I'm walking by your car and it's on fire and I'm holding a bucket of water that I'm not going to use anyway. And you're like, hey, would you mind pouring that on my engine block? My car's on fire. I'm like, okay, but you better buy me lunch. And it's like, I'd be happy to buy you lunch, but does it need to be a transaction? Can you just do it because it's easy and it's the right thing to do and costs you damn near nothing?
One of the things that I think you're pointing out, Chris, is that, you know, from like an ideological standpoint, like, sure, like we could do both. I think from the pragmatic application, what our government does or doesn't do, both parties want something. And if we're all in agreement here that the two issues here are, one, citizenship is difficult, and two, the border security needs to be tackled, then like I don't really know why we would need to separate those and why striking that type of a deal and saying, yes, we will pass both of these will be problematic. Like I know that from, you know, just because they should be able to, sure, like I'd agree with you on that, but
I think both parties don't want it. That's the thing.
That does perpetuate this theatrics.
Yes.
It's theatrics. The Democrats don't actually give a shit about the DACA kids. The Democrats are doing it just to shut up their liberal base.
Yeah.
They don't actually care. And you think Donald Trump gave a shit about the DACA kids? No, Donald Trump wanted a wall, and he didn't even want a wall because he cared about the border. Just like Biden wanted his Build Back Better agenda, Trump wanted his wall. It's the same thing. It's an ego project to say I got something accomplished, and it was literally all you saw there with DACA and the border wall was a dick measuring contest between Pelosi and Trump. That's all it was.
It highlights one of the key issues with our government is that you become an obstructionist because by principle you have to stop the other party.
Chris, I think, again, we probably would agree immigration could get solved pretty dang easily. I think if you get smart people from both sides in a room for a week, you can solve it. But the political classes don't want to solve it. The people on the left want illegal immigration because they think they'll get votes in the future. And the people on the right, the big business and factory owners, want the cheap labor. It's bad all the way around. So, like, I think we'd probably be in pretty close agreement that if you put smart people, put 20 people on the left, 20 people on the right in a room for a week, they can figure it out. But
so
a wedge issue is never meant to be solved.
Yeah.
Okay,
so it's meant to bring in votes. It's meant to bring in opposition votes. And I think you're completely right.
From a principle standpoint, then, what do we think should be the determining factor for who gets to vote? Because you can apply this to felons, which will be our next question, or you can apply it to those voting in local elections. What do you both think should be the standard for someone to be able to vote?
I think if we're going to force people to pay taxes, they get a right to vote.
Okay. Joe Bob, what's your standard?
Again, from a 30,000-foot standpoint, that's a hard thing to argue against. The bigger problem is solving all of the other things that lead to the inability to vote.
Which is fair.
That makes sense.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Okay, so you would rather address, and this is how we got off on the immigration, you would rather address that issue and then bring it over into...
I think we would both want to address that. I think everybody wants to address that issue.
Which is fair.
Freaking just just fix the immigration system. Like the left wants to do it, the right wants to do it. Just freaking fix the thing. And then there are no issues with voting laws of who gets to vote because it's easily viewable, right? Like, I don't know. I feel like I'm a crazy person because nobody else says this sort of thing.
Well, welcome to our show, where we have three people from different points on the political spectrum who have found some common ground, which is great. So maybe this question will spark a little bit more nuance or controversy then. Should felons be allowed to vote? Because they're in prison because they've violated the social contract, and you do give up a certain amount of your rights. Should voting be one of those? Well, let's start with while they're in prison, and then we'll move into like that rehabilitation where they aren't allowed to vote once they're out. So in prison, should felons be allowed to vote?
I think you just kind of said what my thought on that is. Like, if, we have a social contract and we have rules that are agreed upon by everybody, that's democracy or republic, whatever you want to call it. That's how our system works, is everybody agrees on a set of rules. And if you break those rules, you lose certain rights for a period of time. And people will say, well, you're taking away rights. Well, yeah, putting someone in prison is also taking away their rights. So that's not really a good standard to measure which you can actually be able to vote in prison. Not to jump that far ahead, but then once they're out and they've served their time and they've paid their debt to society, it would be odd to not let people vote. That's probably where I stand at. And I would imagine that the majority of Americans would probably be around that area too.
Yeah, I think, I think all three of us are probably going to agree on the rehabilitation part. I think all of us agree that once someone has served their debt to society, they should have a complete and total restoration of rights. Obviously within reason. If someone has committed multiple acts of murder, like, yeah, they probably shouldn't have access to firearms. But like within reason, obviously people should have their rights restored once they've paid their debt to society. But I would counter, and this is where we're going to disagree, I actually do think people should be allowed to vote in prison. And the reason why is we do not believe in a complete taking away of all their rights. Prisoners lose some rights. Prisoners lose their right to travel, right? Prisoners lose their right to personal property. They lose their right to unlawful search and seizure. Like, they do lose certain rights. They lose the right to freedom of speech, but they don't lose their right to practice religion. That's protected. They don't lose their right to a counsel and to the judicial system. That's protected. They don't lose their right to humane treatment. That's protected. So it's like, we don't say that when you're a prisoner, you have no rights. We say when you're a prisoner, there are several rights you lose, and those are there for common sense reasons. You can't have he has a right to unlawful search and seizure. Well, no, because you're in a prison cell.
Right.
Like, you can't do that. You can't have a right to private and personal property in a prison environment. It doesn't work. Now, I'm kind of anti-prison. I think prison should be a place where only horrible, violent offenders go. I don't believe drug offenders and anything like that should be in there. And that's kind of the other problem, is we have guys who are literally losing their rights to vote for ridiculous crimes. But on top of that, again, if you are in prison, you are subject to the authority of the state. The federal and state governments have decided you are now a ward of the state, and they are determining your fate. And part of that is things like electing judges, electing DAs, electing presidents and Senate representatives. And while you're in prison, your representatives still represent you. And if we are going to have people who are subjected to the authority of the government, they still deserve a say in who represents them. So no, I actually don't believe that the right to vote should ever be taken away, with the exception of someone who commits something like voter fraud.
And so, Chris, I would agree with you that I'm going to have you both on at some point or another over discussions over prison reform and immigration reform then too, which is great.
Dude, I have thoughts.
Great. Come on back.
I have a couple.
But where I think I'm going to disagree with Chris then is I think that when someone is in prison, let's just set the bar at like for a violent felony, right? I don't think that person should be allowed to vote on the laws that affect people who have not violated the social contract. Your argument is fair to say that they're still interacting with the government, but really they've put themselves in that position because they chose to violate the social contract, and I don't think that should be rewarded. I don't think that stripping away their right to have that representation in government is problematic while they're in prison, with that caveat. I do agree with both of you that once they're out, rehabilitation needs to happen. But in prison, I do disagree because I don't think that they have shown themselves to be a good member of society, which is why they're in there in the first place. So to me, the question is then, why should they be able to vote for the rules that they've willfully broken to put them there in the first place?
Hold on. Sorry. Can I interject something really quick here too? Because Chris, I think another point of agreement would be that this doesn't necessarily become that big of an issue if some of your bigger mandatory minimum rules are overhauled ever with the changing system that's going on. Like the libertarian side in me, I make my own personal decisions on what I decide to do and what I decide not to do. In what world is my personal business should be cast upon other people and what they decide to do? But that in mind, given the shifting acceptance of different things, especially on different state levels, and then combating that with federal laws that enforce mandatory minimum minimums in states that don't want that in the first place, it would seem that the slow bureaucratic change that hasn't taken place in terms of prison reform would alleviate a lot of this argument again. Again, from a federal government gridlock, roadblocks, all that sort of stuff, that might be an agreement side there. Yeah. I think in terms of just like letting people vote while they're in prison, that it kind of just seems like you either think they should or you think they shouldn't. I happen to be on the side that, like, if you've broken the societal contract, probably not, shouldn't be able to vote there. That's not to say that I don't think prison reforms and mandatory minimums and sentencing can get a constant overhaul. Like, I think that should be constantly worked on. But again, it kind of just seems, like whether you think it's right or wrong. And I don't know. But
I think a lot of it, these issues don't exist in a vacuum, right? And I think a lot of this is, what can you stomach? Because again, we stomach different impediments to our freedom all the time. Fire in a crowded theater, hate speech, that kind of thing, to the First Amendment, that kind of thing, right? But when it comes to taking away rights to things like vote, like for instance, again, no matter what, I think pretty much everyone should have a vote. But I could possibly stomach the loss of that in incarceration. That would be a give I could maybe do if we weren't running a prison police state. If we didn't have the largest prison population in the world, not just numbers, but also per capita, like that's insane. China and North Korea can't touch what our percentage of citizens we have in prison. Like, when you look at China and go, that's a freer society in terms of incarceration, that's terrifying. And so if we didn't have poor people rotting in prison for drug possession charges for the very same drug that young white guys have started up businesses where they're selling pot dispensaries that look like Apple stores, and it's like that guy doesn't get to vote, and it's like that's why I say it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's like, okay, but just to say criminal, well, that if we're talking about someone who had a possession of a rock when they were 18 years old versus someone who went out and murdered people with an axe, that's a very different violation of the social contract. Mm-hmm. And so I could stomach that if we're talking about violent criminals in prison, sure. If we're talking about people who made stupid decisions when they were 18 years old that didn't actually result in anyone's death or dismemberment or harm, no, I don't believe you should lose your civil rights over that.
That comes back to then the whole like sentencing reform and all that stuff, which I think
agree with you on.
We would agree that it's a working system that needs to constantly be looked at and scrutinized. I would probably have to push back on the whole China thing in North Korea. I think not to say that our numbers aren't big, but first thing I would say is, we've agreed on a set of laws, and if we need more prisons to put those people who have decided to break that contract in there, I don't have a problem with that. And two, we have no idea how many people in China or North Korea are in prison. It's kind of like the coronavirus thing. We have no idea how many people actually died, because I don't believe any of the numbers that they put out.
Self-report with an incentive. I would agree. I think that, Chris, you've noted a weakness and a problem within the system. And I can agree with you there that it exists. And like, if it creates an incentive to imprison more people, then that has a weakness. But at the same time, like you mentioned, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. I think that the answer would be that these people still, when they are in prison, they're repaying their debt to society. To me, part of that debt repayment would come from the stripping away of this right in particular while they're in prison, especially for violent things. But I can also agree with you, Chris, about how we need reform on a lot of these things. Like, I don't think that there is the same weight to all crimes, because there's not, which is why they're going to have different sentences and they're going to have different repercussions depending on whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor, etc.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some nuance we disagree on, but I think we agree on most of the major principles on that.
Because most Americans agree on most things for the most part. Like, that's my big thing here. Like, nuance-wise, there's going to be disagreements, but like, we're not nearly as polarized as the media makes us believe.
I think we're incredibly polarized on several things, and that's the things the media likes to highlight.
That's true.
I think most Americans agree on Joe Bob said it perfectly. Most Americans agree on most things. I think there are issues that we are incredibly divided on. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I absolutely, again, we have our news agencies are for profit, and so it's a dog and pony show, and it is entertainment more than anything. And so they're not going to talk about the things we agree on. They're going to talk about the things that divide us, and that's what creates views and likes and clicks and advertisement space.
And they no longer have to contextualize it, because you get one person who has, like, of course you can bring me a person, you can bring me a Nazi who's going to give Chris and his podcast a bunch of hate online, right? Or or anybody.
Oh, they do.
Where of course you can find outliers, but if you actually sit down and have conversations, I really do think you guys hit it on the head that you're gonna have more overlap overlap than most people initially believe. Go to check out their podcast for the disagreements that Chris and I did have. Absolutely.
That was a good one.
We're going to kind of touch on that again because as we see states passing laws over their individual way that they'd like to conduct their elections, you've got different arguments for what is and is not problematic. So most recently, you've seen like Georgia has passed state voting laws and Texas has had stuff on the table. To my knowledge, they haven't passed yet. But we kind of get into this idea of the states are suppressing votes has been the accusation, which is what led to the most recent bill that died on the Senate, which was trying to give the federal government control over state elections. So I'll just start broad. What do you guys think about the state voting laws versus federal voting laws, suppressing votes, going for voter security? What do you think?
I think the only thing that matters in this country is that people believe the elections. Without people believing in the democracy that we have nothing. Now, and that's regardless who wins. Obviously, I have people who I would like to win, but regardless of who wins, the country will be more or less intact if people as a whole agree on the fact that the elections were fair and conducted fairly. In a country where nobody believes the elections, and this comes from both sides too. Hillary Clinton in 2016, I think a third of Democrats didn't believe Donald Trump's election. And then obviously you have the Trump thing going on with 2020 and still continuing. All that's to say is the only thing that actually matters is that people believe the elections. And that's where I tend to work back from of like, okay, well, if this happens, is that going to promote more belief in the election system or is that going to decrease it? And so that's kind of where I start. I'm interested to hear, Chris, where you come from in terms of on the voting stuff that's going on.
I think your argument earlier for DACA actually really applies. Kind of like this, like you were saying earlier about the New York non-citizen voting, that it's a Band-Aid and we need to fix the system. Voting has only become more reliable as time goes on, right? As the numbers get bigger and the bureaucracy gets larger, voting fraud only lessens as time goes on. And I think, sure, here's the thing. I'm not opposed to voter IDs. Just kind of like, okay, you want people to vote, but you want there to be an overhaul of the immigration system. That's the bigger issue. Well, instead of saying everyone needs a voter ID, how about we overhaul the voter ID system? Why don't we simply make having a government ID easy to obtain in terms of time, not background check, but that's what the government does behind the scenes anyway.
Yeah, fix the DMV.
Yeah, make it easy on the citizen and make it free. I mean, that's the thing is it's not that ID costs a huge amount of money, but to a poor person, it is an expense. I mean, I looked this up, that if depending on what state you live in, the combined cost of document fees, travel expenses, and waiting time range between $75 to $175. And to someone who's having trouble keeping their power bill on, that actually matters. And make it free. And it's like, if we can give free, easy to obtain government ID, I'm all for it. But as soon as you've put a hurdle between a person and obtaining that ID, well, this is poll taxes.
I just have a question. So at what point, what is no longer a hurdle? Because I think that's the thing where people have to draw a line. Is then driving a car to a polling place a hurdle? And if that's the case, then say the government orders Ubers for everybody. Then is having the ability to order that Uber, quote unquote, a hurdle? Then you got to give some of that. And then if that's the case, like where do those? Because there will always be quote unquote hurdles to doing anything, not just voting. So I guess I would wonder, where's the line when it comes to quote unquote hurdles to vote?
There is, but that's why we allow things like absentee ballots. That's why soldiers who are stationed overseas get to vote absentee, because everyone can't make it in. There are people who are disabled who can't make it into a polling place. So it's like we already acknowledge that these hurdles exist and we work to counteract them. Hurdles to IDs exist. So yeah, let's fix the DMV and let's make getting identification free. Let's make obtaining your birth certificate free. It's a government document. It's right there. I shouldn't have to pay $30 for them to fax me a document they already have there scanned and computerized.
Especially when all of 50% of my income already goes to the government. Why the heck can't
exactly.
that be free? Yeah, no, I'm with you on that.
I'm paying for it already. I have already paid for this. My taxes have gone to these bureaucracies, have gone to the DMV and the records offices. So as a citizen, I'm sorry, I should have absolute free access to this because I've already paid.
In regards to voter fraud with the absentee ballots thing, I don't know. Chris, where do you live?
California.
Oh, okay, cool. So I'm in California also.
Okay, I'm in LA.
Oh, nice. I'm in Riverside County.
Oh, yeah, you're not far at all. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but the ballot harvesting, and I can go into, I don't know if you want me to, go into some personal like ballot harvesting problems that just really, really, really diminish even my own personal belief in the election system in California. People talk about voter fraud, how there's not a ton of voter fraud, and that's fine. I guess that's technically true, but California's Secretary of State, so there's 40 million voters, 30 million voters in the state of California. The Secretary of State's office has 2 people in the entire state dedicated to tracking down voter fraud, which to me seems crazy. And then you throw ballot harvesting in there, and there's a lot of like Republicans and Democrats have benefited from ballot harvesting in their own individual way. And I think both sides are effectively cheating when it comes to doing that sort of thing. And I don't want either party doing that. And that's where it comes back down to if we don't trust the system that's set up, we have nothing. Regardless of who wins, the trust in the system is the only thing that matters. And if we lose that trust, which I have in the state of California because of some of these like rules that you're allowed to do what? That I think is the biggest problem. So like, when it comes to the idea of, voter fraud isn't all that prevalent, it's like, yeah, kind of.
Well, voter fraud for voter impersonation. Having a driver's license doesn't stop ballot harvesting. We're talking about having picture ID. All that stops is voter impersonation. NYU Law did a huge study on this. Since 2000, there have been exactly 31, not even convictions, 31 credible allegations of voter impersonation. That's over 1 billion ballots. There's 31 allegations that have credibility.
Yeah,
and that's not even convictions. The conviction rate's much lower, but we're not going to go with that. We're going to go with no. This is something that someone of any credible state, a ballot official or an election official, has called into question. Where like, yeah, we do see a duplicate record, or we do see this signature didn't match. That's a credible allegation.
So where I see the issue is that a lot of the Democratic Party and people who are in favor of things like, let's say, ballot harvesting or just ballot pushes, which is where like right now anybody can request an absentee, but what they're trying to push for in a lot of these newer legislation attempts is we just want to en masse send out paper ballots that people can send in. And what they're doing and what becomes fallacious is they say, well, currently status quo, we don't have evidence of voter fraud. So therefore we can change how secure the election is and assume that it will not go up. And like Georgia has had a lot of flack for answering legitimate concerns like what you mentioned, Chris, which was like, well, if you need a voter ID, not everybody can access one, which is true. And we also think that it's going to be true that you need that for security purposes. So like Georgia actually put in that law that they passed that they caught a lot of flack for, the state had to provide a voter ID for free to the citizens. And like to me, I feel like that answers both, right? And it answers both the issues of what is security and what is accessibility, and it balances the two because we are trying to balance the two there. Go ahead, Joe Bob.
They also said you can't bring your family water while they're waiting in line.
Well, actually, that's not true.
Very true.
The Washington Post actually fact-checked that, gave it 4 Pinocchios, which is important. What you can't do is within 150 feet, the people who are running the campaigns, they can't offer them a gift of any kind. And they expanded that to include water and food. What you can do is you can provide water while in lines. So as long as they're not within a certain distance, and as long as it's not the campaigns providing it, that you can bring your own water if you want to.
The registrar of voter does. Like the actual voting center can have water stuff. But the electioneering has been illegal since forever. And it should be, because the second you allow anybody to give anything in line, one guy's going to show up with water, and then the AOC campaign is going to show up with soda, and then the Trump campaign is going to show up with sandwiches, and then the AOC campaign is going to show up with pizza. Like I don't think you can have anybody giving anything in line other than like water provided by the voting stations, and I don't have any problem with taxpayers paying for that.
Yeah, I think that would kind of solve it. Again, I would agree with that if that's. But do we honestly? That's what you're thinking? Is you think Kemp was sitting there in his office and he's like, you know what? I'm tired of these Democrats winning vote with their fancy waters. That was not what it was. This was absolutely to discourage people from voting in long lines. You think Kemp sits up at night and he goes, man, those Democrats are stealing people with their waterways? You think that's what really happened, dude? Come on.
Well, no,
be realistic.
But you also missed a part in the law that said like if the voting lines are longer than like 20 minutes, I forget specifically what it is, and maybe we could pull it up. Then the county registrar gets under scrutiny by the state registrar's office. So like with the idea that you can't give anybody else anything in line, there's also a huge push to not have long lines, which again I think is great.
But it doesn't solve the problem because we still have the long lines.
I feel like that comes as a result of what I think you would agree is a good thing. There's more people participating in the democratic process of voting.
Yes, but then we need the democratic process to set up more polling places, and it's funny
and that might be true.
Polling places open longer hours in richer neighborhoods.
Well, it might be true that at that point we do need more places for polling, but what these laws are attempting to address is the fact that you can't have lax security and still claim voter security. Like you need to balance the two. And what they did was they removed a lot of the extra polling places because it wasn't as secure and we didn't have the need post-COVID.
Yeah,
And they limited the hours 7 to 7 instead of like 24/7 drop boxes, which cannot be staffed by our understaffed, governmental.
Why not?
I mean, we could make the argument that they should put more money towards staffing them, but what you can't do is claim
government buildings. They are staffed.
But they didn't.
These drop boxes aren't in front of the Quick Mart.
But
they're in front of post offices.
But they weren't exclusively in those places, is what I'm saying. Like they removed ones because they had them up all over in the COVID so people could spread out.
During the COVID crisis,
right?
Yes.
And where I support what Georgia did was, if we're not in the same state of emergency with COVID, then we don't have the need to just have 24/7 drop boxes that cannot be staffed 24/7.
Why can't we have 24/7 drop boxes that are places where that is already legitimate to staff? Like, why don't we have it at every single post office, every single DMV, every single government building has a drop box that's cambered and secured?
But that's not the question that we're answering here. You're pointing out a valid issue. Like, we could obviously have more, but I'm saying that you can't say that removing unsecured locations when we no longer have a need is the same thing.
But I think we have a need. We don't necessarily have the same COVID need, but I'm sorry, like, this is intended to discourage participation. That is the reason for it.
So I'm curious, how do you explain the highest voter turnout in the history of the country last cycle?
Donald Trump. Donald Trump's angry tweets. Everyone got really butthurt about him, and that was literally that. Donald Trump is the reason why we have such a high election.
Totally. And so it's kind of difficult then to make the argument that it needs to be easier to vote, right?
Why? You know what they do in most free nations? In most free nations, voting is a holiday. In most free nations, you are registered to vote upon reaching adulthood automatically. Like, we don't have any of this. You want to vote, it's got to be on a weekday during working hours where a lot of people can't take off work. Well, I missed voting several times. I used to be an emergency dispatcher working 12-hour shifts. Guess who had a hard time voting?
And that would be hard. And what I think is important to note is that Georgia...
Why is it a national holiday?
But
and why are we discouraging...
Georgia... But that's a distracting argument is really what it is, because it's pointing out an issue that we can agree on, but it's not answering the main question. It seems like you're kind of trying to justify, like, oh, we should en masse send out ballots, or we should just have places, even if they're unstaffed, because we have a need.
I'm trying to point out that I believe that these are solutions in search of a problem. Like, we're going to talk about voter ID, right? Let's look at some numbers. And I've got these links if you want them.
Sure.
I mean, this is up to 25% of African-American citizens of voting age lack government-issued photo ID. 8% of white people have that.
I don't care.
Okay. Texas allows concealed weapons permits for voting, but it doesn't allow student ID cards, which are government issued.
Yeah, but you have to remember, a government issue is not equal. If I'm going to get a concealed carry permit, I am fingerprinted and tracked by the government. If I go to school, that's not the same. So, what you're comparing is two different forms of ID and saying because they were issued by a government entity, then they're equal.
Actually, they are. If you go to college, buddy, you are absolutely fingerprinted. Your ID has been verified by that university.
It goes by state, though. California, that might be true. Texas, Tennessee, North Dakota, Kentucky, where I've attended school, that's not.
Well, but then shouldn't Texas and Kentucky get their shit together? Like, that sounds like that's a bigger, kind of like the immigration thing. Like, then why aren't we fixing the problem rather than telling people they shouldn't vote? And what I'm pointing out is there's similarities here, okay? If we are discouraging people who have longer working hours, people who are poorer, right? If we're discouraging something that disproportionately affects African-American people. North Carolina had their law that got taken out where public assistance IDs and state employee ID cards, which you want to talk about a verified system, those are held mostly by black voters, and that was taken down because of that. They said you can't do that because those are valid IDs. And it's like, we know this. UCSD did a huge study showing that voter ID requirements absolutely proved it with statistics lessen turnout by people of color hugely.
Hold on, but that's not because of their color. It's just a happenstance of how it works out. That's not, nobody's targeting
how that
anybody
works.
on race.
Isn't it interesting how whenever the right wing, again, I don't even say right wing, because libertarians typically want everyone to vote. Republicans Republicans. When the GOP puts through this stuff, isn't it funny how it always just happens to be demographics that vote Democrat?
But you're basing so the overarching assumption that photo ID or government issue ID in general disproportionately affects minorities is rooted in what is both incorrect and also a racist assumption to say that they have a harder time getting photo ID. What they've done there, but if
that's statistics.
I don't. But you have to be careful.
What you're effectively saying is us minorities are too dumb to get a free ID.
Which not at all.
I don't find that offensive, but I know a lot of people who do.
What I'm saying is that on the numbers, on average, in this country, the more melanin in your skin, the less income you have on average.
But that's conflating causation and correlation because
I am not saying these voting laws are creating racial disparity.
But your argument is extrapolated, though, to then say that means that they're suppressing minority votes, which is incorrect.
So you think that that's what it is, that because there was 31 allegations out of a billion votes, that's what it was, that they were just like, no, even if it maybe discredits certain races or it looks really bad, we just got to get to the bottom of this because I just believe in absolute freedom and joy and hugs and kisses.
Well, that wasn't what I said at all.
Motivated whatsoever.
What I said, and let's take this, but and I didn't. I agree with you. You can't say that.
This is politically motivated. This is to disenfranchise certain voters, and I do not believe it's because Abbott was like, I don't want black people voting. No, it's Abbott didn't want Democrats voting.
Let's zoom out then, and why do you say it's to target them in that way?
Again, because that's what the numbers say. We have statistics that show voter ID laws have a statistical significance in discouraging turnout by people of color.
No, the numbers say there's a statistical difference between
significance. Again, I'll send you the link right now. USCSD did the math.
Right, but I'm saying that you can show a statistically significant difference between groups. That doesn't mean that it is causing them to not. Like you have to be careful how that is contextualized because the statistics aren't saying what you're saying.
But they do prove causation because they analyze before and after effects of simply these voter ID laws.
I would like to bring reminder of the fact that the only thing I care about is voter integrity. In my view, I don't understand how we don't just have people go to a voting place where they live, show their voting ID, get a ballot, mark that ballot, and then put it into a concealed envelope. To me, that's the best form of not having any voter fraud issues or any questions of voter fraud. And if for some reason those very sound rules tend to disproportionately have outcomes that are, less Chinese people between the age of 30 and 40 turn out to vote because of that. That has nothing to do with that demographic. It just has specifically to do with the integrity part, in my view.
You're not wrong. Like, that thing is, in Joe Bob's scenario here, that's a good solution. But then that requires the government to guarantee free and easy accessible voter ID laws and have massive, easily accessible during non-working hours polling places. And if those are in effect, I'm on board.
Ballot harvesting, right? Anybody can turn in anybody's ballot in the state of California, which is crazy to me. But let's just say, hypothetically.
I actually agree with you.
Okay, cool. Well then, so in terms of voter integrity, in 2020, ballot harvesting was now coming to the forefront. In 2018, it passed in 2017, got signed into law in 2017. 2018, Republicans got smacked because nobody knew about it, and Democrats were going around collecting ballots because we have all of the data on every single voter. And then in 2020, in a presidential election, when Democrats usually turn out way more in force, especially in blue states, Republicans won 5 congressional seats in California. How did that happen? And churches set up drop boxes, right? And I'm not saying this happened. I'm just saying in theory it could happen, which to me is just as bad as it actually happening. They collect ballots and they have the data. They can cross-reference people's names and say, well, this person is a registered Republican. We're not going to open the ballot. We're not going to see, but they're a registered Republican. We're going to put them in this pile. And this person is a registered Democrat. We're going to put it in this pile. They take the Republican ballots, go to the ROV, turn those in. Then maybe, because the law says that they have to make a valid attempt, they go to Skid Row with the Democrat ballots, give some homeless guy $100 and says, please turn this into the registrar's office. Now, maybe those ballots get there, but also maybe they end up at the bottom of the LA River. That is a scenario that can actually happen in the state of California. And whether or not it does is irrelevant. It's the fact that it could happen diminishes the value of the election system, which, back to the beginning point, is the only thing that I think actually matters. People have to believe in the system. And if there are conceivable cracks in a lot of different cases, that's a problem on both sides. I don't want Republicans doing that. I don't want Democrats doing that. I don't want independents. I don't want libertarians. I don't want anybody doing that because it diminishes the value of our integrity in our elections. That's my sole point, is the only thing that matters is the integrity of it. And just regardless of what the outcome is versus proportional races and ages and income levels, I don't care. We just have to believe in the system.
Well, I think that was a whole lot of maybes and hypotheticals for someone who just lectured me on causational math. But
if it can exist, it has to be ironclad. Like, I can't sit here as a consultant in California running races in California and be thinking of ways to cheat legally.
Yeah, but that's where you're going to be surprised that I do actually agree with you. I don't believe in ballot harvesting. Now, here's the thing: is I think going necessarily to a polling place for disabled people and the ultra elderly, no. But then we can make accommodations for that. That small minority of people can be accommodated. But I agree.
And we've been doing that.
Yeah, but having a massive vote where anybody can turn in any ballot to anywhere is a problem. And it's actually not a problem, but I agree with you. There's an easily exploitable potential problem there. And I'm fine with it, which is why I think the greater system of make voting a national holiday, automatically register citizens to vote, and make voting ID free and easy to obtain. And if you do that, then I'm on board with your solution. I'm into it. That's great. Let's go to polling places that are secured, and let's make secured ballots where everyone can feel secure in the vote that they've cast.
I have one question. If we're going to make, and this is just again a hypothetical, if we're going to make Election Day a national holiday, which other national holiday are we willing to give up? Because one thing I'm so against is giving the federal freaking government employees another taxpayer-funded day off. So
President's Day. Pick it.
Okay. I honestly don't care.
Mattress sale.
Let's.
I think that's more important than mattresses.
Let's get rid of 3 other days, and then I'm not for giving people an extra holiday off. But honestly, if I were being completely honest, I don't necessarily have a problem, but I don't think that would actually benefit. All of the people that I know who don't vote aren't doing it because they don't have time to, and maybe there are some exceptions to that. But the people that I know who are not exactly the most politically engaged, but will vote when they get around to it, are going to use that federal holiday to go to the beach. So I don't know. And you can't compel somebody to vote either.
I do want to go back to that study, Chris. I did look over it. So one of the main issues that I see with this is what they say that they did was they compared states who have voter ID to states that don't. And then they compared the minority turnout in both of those states. And they also compared whether or not they had strict ID. And they said that in states with voter ID, you have lower minority turnout. What that doesn't
turnout per capita, though, because
but that doesn't demonstrate that they had a lower turnout because of voter ID, and that's why you can't claim causation.
No,
and that's what I was trying to say earlier.
Yeah, and I would agree. This one study of this does not show causation. What I'm saying is that every time we have a study, it shows the same thing. It shows that voter impersonation is so low, it's almost non-existent. It happens less than lottery and lightning strikes do. It happens. I'm not going to say
voter impersonation at the polls, and my concern is not at the polls. My concern with security is like with the mass push out of ballots.
That's where voter ID comes into. So if we're going to talk about the mass ballot harvesting, like Joe Bob's talking about, that's where I'm far more in line with you guys.
Right.
I'm agreeing with you. We need to have secure elections. Voter IDs don't accomplish that. They may in the future, but that's not the problem right now. And we focus on it, and the focus is to disenfranchise voters. I mean, when Kemp purged his rolls in Georgia, it was 560,000 people who got flagged because they'd skipped too many elections. And again, APM did an investigation. 65% of the people who were purged, who re-registered, did it in the same county. They just happened to have not shown up for the last 2 elections.
There's 2 sides of that, because California doesn't purge their voter rolls. And I may know somebody very close to me whose grandma passed away several years ago, and maybe her husband, who is still alive, continues to vote for her in the state of California. Again, that is a bad, you have to purge voter rolls to an extent.
You're purging voter rolls based on death records, not on whether or not you've participated lately, because that's not how civil rights work.
That's another fix the bureaucratic system, because the death records don't coordinate with the ROV and there's so many variables in the system itself that need problems. And with that, I'd probably be we should purge. My main point is responsible purging of voter rolls does need to happen.
Yes, agreed.
I'm not opposed to having people have to register every single time, to at least say, hey, I still live here. And all that can be is like a simple click on a box on a website. But again, I can be argued to have that as a longer duration. But main thing is responsible purging does need to happen. And I don't know that the Georgia purging, if you don't show up for 2 elections, is all that irresponsible.
I think it's very irresponsible. You don't lose your civil rights because you haven't used them lately.
Well, you don't lose them. Re-register.
Yeah.
You don't lose them.
And that comes down to what is your personal responsibility? Because if you show up and you don't know whether or not you're registered, to me, that's on you. Because you could absolutely check online. It's not like I have to stand through a line for 7 hours to show up and find out that I didn't register.
Okay, but
if I'm not on the
who lives
roll,
alone isn't internet savvy.
Say that again.
An 80-year-old who lives alone is not internet and computer
Well,
savvy.
there's plenty of ways around that. Then they could ask an absentee ballot. They could have their kids do it. Like you're showing a single example.
Purge people. Like why don't we just make sure dead people don't vote?
But
I'm agreeing with that. I think that's great. Let's purge voter rolls responsibly. And purging people who haven't been here lately is not a responsible method. Especially this is the governor. He has access to who's paying taxes, who hasn't filed for unemployment, who has a gas bill, who has left the county. Like they know this shit. It's like again, just like Joe Bob was saying. How about we fix some shit broken bureaucracy?
Do you think that office is competent enough to put those pieces together? My answer would be no. I don't know if there's any government entity
that's competent enough to keep their own records, and they're not competent enough to purge voter polls.
I don't know. I see again. Like I'm of the opinion of like I don't care if you have to re-register for a primary and then re-register again for the general a couple months later. That's just and I'm also probably jaded by way too many of these ballots getting sent out to old dead people. I ran a race in 2018 and this guy went to an abandoned Starbucks location in like Malibu and 146 ballots got sent there. That's a problem. And maybe that's what that sort of stuff and seeing that sort of stuff a lot pushes my idea toward, dude, just re-register every single time and make it easy to do so. Like get an email or a letter or something like that. But yeah, the purging the voter rolls, I've seen so many problems with that. I'm like, I might tend to be a little bit extreme on like, make sure people are still living in the same place, all that sort of, and maybe you're right. Maybe the idea of that the government should.
Extreme. I think you have legitimate gripes, but I'm saying let's solve those gripes. I think they're good ones, and I think they're problems that need solving. But purging voter rolls randomly does not solve those problems. Let's actually fix those things because you make good points. There are broken ass things in our voting system. Let's fix the broken things. Let's stop dead people from voting. And yeah, let's purge voter rolls, but let's purge voter rolls in a nonpartisan way and not of I don't like these people who haven't been here for 2 elections. Fuck them. Like no, that's a bad way to purge voter rolls. I'm sorry. I know.
You're good.
I apologize, man.
Chris, I'm actually curious. Is there a system in which you can tell, you can cross-reference the ROV registered voters with who got purged? Because I'd actually be curious to see that data. Because if
the way the APM found it was again, they had to only go by who took the time, like you said, to re-register. That was the only way to find the data. So it's not even indicative of everyone. What they found was 65% of the people purged under the use it or lose it who re-registered did it in the same county. So they hadn't even moved. That was all we know.
In a court of law, you got to prove somebody did do something, not prove it didn't happen. So I actually, if they did prove that, well, Kemp just purged Democrats, or like 90% of the people that he purged were Democrats, I'd be like, yeah, that is a freaking problem that I don't want to see happen. But until that's like nailed down, and I don't know that it can be.
I don't think it can be either.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
But I don't know. Again, the point is, it was a completely ridiculous voter purge. Again, let's purge responsibly. Let's purge smartly. Let's create a system that actually unifies these numbers of who has died, who has moved. Like, it shouldn't be that hard to do.
Yeah,
I can agree to that.
It's a lack of will.
I think again what we need to be careful about is just saying that it is racially motivated or it is based off of party.
I'm saying Brian Kemp is party motivated. That's the thing is, I don't trust these actors.
Could be.
You think Abbott and Kemp are really interested in the integrity of bipartisan votership? They're not, and you know they're not, and that's where I'm coming from.
But you also have to remember it wasn't Abbott and Kemp it was their
Nancy
state
Pelosi
congressional.
Is interested in fairness? No.
Well, I don't think that on an individual level they probably don't. But here's the thing, though: it was passed by the Georgia Senate. It wasn't just an executive order; it was actually a law that was passed. So it wasn't even them. So
by the heavy Republican Georgia Senate.
Well, sure,
with 2 Democratic senators.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely stilted in favor of. Republicans.
So we have a Republican governor passing a draconian measure through a Republican Senate.
I don't think it's draconian.
And you're going to say, oh, this isn't party. Again, this isn't party. It's like, this is absolutely, and again, I don't think they woke up and they were like, let's make sure this color people can't vote. No, they wanted to make sure that either Democrats go to, or at least maybe secure cheap political points, but this was party motivated. This was the Republicans and Democrats continuing their pissing match.
Well, do we have any last responses to this before we go on and everybody gets their final final say in our hot takes.
Other than I think at the very, very basis of it, obviously we're going to argue over details all day, every day.
Yeah.
The system freaking is out of whack.
Yes.
Maybe if we can solidify the system, then we can actually have nuanced conversations about the details. But the bottom line is that if the system is crazy, and we didn't even talk, in this context of voter ID, we didn't even consider the illegal immigration voting system, there's so many different variables that the system lets slip by. So if there's one common denominator there, it seems like, hey, let's fix the freaking system.
Agreed.
All right. Well, we'll be right back with our hot takes. And we never actually go anywhere, but this originally was airing on a local radio station. And so we just had it in there and, nostalgia, so I just kept it.
I like it.
All right. So this is where we get our... Well, I won't have a chance to respond to anybody's thoughts. All right. So my first hot take is I'm really happy that we were able to find so much common ground and still have enough nuance to have a great debate and discussion over this. This was fun. I think my big takeaway from this is that the federal government and the state governments are all sorts of messed up. They make this more difficult than it needs to be on everything, whether it's voting or whether it's immigration. It's just overly complicated. However, my second hot take is going to be that I think that we need to be careful when we're claiming that something is racially motivated or party motivated. Again, going back to that study, if they wanted to say that these are obstacles and are causing lower turnout, then they need to account for not just a comparison of, a state with more voter ID had lower turnout per capita minority than one that didn't. They would actually need to go state by state and say, did those who didn't have a state-issued voter ID as a person of a specific race then have a harder time voting? And they don't account for that. So to me, the study is garbage, especially since most of the words in there are, we think, we infer, we're just double checking these things. They don't actually report what they're doing. So I have an issue when we're going to go through and claim that state laws trying to shore up security automatically means that they're racist or racially motivated, or in particular, the buzzword lately has been suppressing the vote. Lines are not suppressing the vote. I agree with Chris that we can have more slots up. We could make it so that lines are shorter. But I also disagree when we're starting to say that that means that we're suppressing votes. So I really think that we need to be careful with how we use that language. And that'll be my last hot take.
I think if you don't want people to think you're shoplifting, you probably shouldn't walk through a store with a trench coat full of bulging pockets. And I think if you don't want people to think you have racially motivated draconian voting laws, then you should ensure that they're not affecting people on a racial bias, or at least those numbers can't be conflated. And you're right, 100%. It does not automatically ensure anything. What I find are unreliable actors creating things that maybe coalesce, but it's very suspicious. And if you're an elected official overseeing elections, it's your job to not look suspicious. And both sides of that. That includes ballot farming, and that also includes these voter ID laws. And I think the onus is on the representative to make sure they look clean while doing it. And it doesn't take a whole lot of steps to ensure that you can't conflate racism with this, because voting in America is historically incredibly race motivated. We've only had non-racialized elections for less than a century. So that wound is still fresh, and I think the onus is on elected representatives to make sure their voting laws represent everybody, and they can show that this is clean rather than just having us hope. And I think this is all a system of a bad two-party system that neither party actually cares about the American voter.
Yeah. Is this my turn? Do I do a hot take? Is my take currently warm?
It has to be hot.
Spicy.
So, I think I would agree. There are definitely different things that we can do to overhaul the election. As far as race goes, I'm of the mind I wish Americans would just stop talking about race to a large extent. Obviously not, it's never going to be muted entirely, but just because something has a different outcome, I don't think means that it was intended that way. But at the same time, I don't have a problem with opening up new rules or having different strategies get put into place, so long as we maintain the integrity of the election. Now, my personal belief is the integrity of election needs to get clamped down super tight. And then that also doesn't help with the political drivers. When Joe Biden said that the new Georgia laws are Jim Crow on steroids, I thought that was one of the worst things a president has ever said. Jim Crow was terrible. Black people got lynched and beaten in the streets for the act of voting. And to say that having a voter ID is like that, but way worse, isn't going to help the conversation that may actually need to be had. And so from a political standpoint, I think we've got some bigger fish to fry. And ultimately what it comes down to is we need to have we need to have faith in the elections. And if we don't, we are freaking screwed. And this is a both sides issue. And unfortunately, for the next foreseeable future, it would appear that whoever loses is going to claim that the election was unfair, which is not a good place to be as a country. So that is why I'm advocating for as clamped down integrity voting laws as humanly possible.
Well, thank you both for coming. Before we go, Chris, where can they find the Alt Left podcast if they want to listen to some of your less discussion-based with diverse ideas?
In the darkest corners of Soviet Russia. Again, the best place to find us, again, is on Twitter at the Alt Left Pod. Our link tree is there, but yeah, you can find us on Podbean. You can find us on Spotify. We even have a YouTube channel. You can just Google the Alt Left Podcast. You'll find it almost anywhere. We're even on Facebook, but we're probably going to take that down because Facebook's terrible. But the best place to find us, seriously, hit up our Twitter at the Alt Left Pod, and you'll see all of our links and all of our goodies there.
Okay. And Joe Bob, where can they find you?
Instagram is probably the best thing. I like to post on Instagram at JOBOB, Joe Bob. That's pretty much it. Also, the Daily Caller live show is live every morning. I know there are people that have, Daily Caller is founded by Tucker Carlson, and people have some varying opinions on Tucker. Know that the only thing we try to do on that show is be fair, obviously, have a point of view, but there's no sense in making unfair arguments, at least in my opinion, on my show. But yeah, you can find me there. I love having open discussions. Chris, I really, really appreciate coming on here and talking things out. There are so many instances where I'm put in positions in front of people that vehemently disagree, and the first thing they say is, well, you're a white supremacist. I'm like, okay, I'm a brown white supremacist. Great. Now we have where do we go from there? Because you've gone to 100 and now we can't talk. So I really, really appreciate coming on. Ryan, thanks for hosting this thing and having a forum to talk about things because, like I said at the very beginning, I think most Americans agree on a lot of things, and I would like to be able to debate the nuances as opposed to, you're a white supremacist and you're a communist. Like, sorry, I wasn't. You know what I mean? You don't want to because at that point, all conversation is stunted, and that, I think, is the biggest problem. It's not who wins elections necessarily. It's the culture of the United States not being able to get along with their neighbor and talk about things in a coherent way. So,
and divisiveness is what the two-party system wants.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm sure you find yourself somewhere between the liars. You can find us Between the Liars on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Twitch, and Google Podcasts. Follow our social media to stay updated. We'll try to bring you more great guests and great discussion like this. Thank you, Chris and Joe Bob, for your contributions and the great discussion. We will absolutely have you back on in the near future. Goodbye for now.
Can't wait.